The night settled over the lower hives the way it always settled, not with the gentle persuasion of darkness falling over a world that has earned its rest, but with the mechanical certainty of lumen strips cycling down. To their lowest setting, the amber glow fading to a dull, bruised orange that made the shadows deeper and the silences louder, and the particular quality of the lower hives at night even more oppressive than the lower hives during the day. Damien sat in his hole behind the moisture collector with his knees drawn up to his chest and his back pressed against the cold stone, listening to the drip of recycled water and the distant groaning hum of the hives. Infrastructure. And he was not sleeping because sleeping meant dreaming, and dreaming meant remembering, and remembering meant the singing girl and the wire-tricked boy and the little ones with the cups in the soft hands. That had taken them and the silence that had followed. He had been thinking about them all day, thinking about them while he walked the market and counted his coppers and dodged the rocks the crowd threw at him and gave away money he could not afford to give, thinking about them while he ran from the robed figure in his alley and pressed himself into the dark corner of another dead end and waited for the pursuit to fade. And the thinking was not the abstract, philosophical thinking of a person wondering about the nature of injustice, but the concrete, physical thinking of a child who knows exactly where his friends used to stand and notices with the particular sharpness of loss that they are no longer. Standing there, the spaces they occupied had been filled with nothing, with silence, with the particular quality of an absence that is louder than any presence could be. The singing girl had been in the thoroughfare every morning for as long as Damien could remember, standing on an overturned crate with her eyes closed and her mouth open, singing songs in a language that was not quite the language of the lower hives and not quite the language of the upper hives, but something in between, something that belonged to the spaces between the stalls and the gaps in the crowd and the particular quality of a voice that exists because the world needs a voice that exists. She had once given him half a loaf of bread when he had not eaten in 3 days, had pressed it into his hands with the particular stubbornness of a person who has decided that the giving is going to happen whether the receiving is wanted or not. And she had said, "Eat, you need it more than I do." And the saying had been so much like his mother's saying that he had almost cried, had almost let the tears come, had swallowed them back down, because his mother had taught him not to cry over food. Because the crying was a luxury and the eating was a necessity, and you could not do both at the same time. The wire-trick boy had been 2 stalls down, a skinny thing with quick fingers and a grin that showed too many teeth, who could make bits of twisted metal dance between his knuckles, the way Damien could make stones dance in the air. And he had once laughed at Damien's juggling and called him a show-off, and the laughing had been the closest thing to a compliment Damien had received in a year, had been the closest thing to a friend, had been the closest thing to a person acknowledging that he existed, and that his existence was something worth commenting on, even if the commenting was mocking. And the little ones with the cups, the ones who sat in the corners and said nothing and asked for nothing and simply existed in the peripheral vision of the crowd until someone's conscience stirred enough to drop a copper. And their silence was the silence that Damien knew best. The silence of bodies that have learned to make themselves small, to make themselves invisible, to make themselves into things that can be looked past and looked through and looked away from, because the looking was how you drew attention, and the attention was how you disappeared, and the disappearing was what the robed men did, what they had done, what they were going to do again tomorrow and the day after and the day after that, until every child in the lower hives had been gathered up and carried away in soft hands to whatever place the robed men carried the children they gathered. Damien pulled his knees tighter against his chest and pressed his forehead against them and thought about the fortress of Hera. He could see it from the mouth of his alley if he turned his head at exactly the right angle, a vast, gleaming shape on the horizon that rose above the slums and the hastily constructed buildings and the barracks like a fist raised against the sky, and it was enormous, was impossible, was the seat of power on Macragge, the place where the decisions were made and the orders were given and the people who could stop the robed men lived, and worked and slept behind walls 100 meters tall. He had never been inside. No one from the lower hives had ever been inside. The walls were smooth and featureless and unclimbable. The gates were guarded by men in armor so thick it looked like they were wearing small buildings. The perimeter was patrolled by machines that could see in the dark and hear a whisper at 100 meters and put a bolt round through a man's chest before he had finished drawing breath. And the knowing of all this was the knowing that made the fortress a thing that existed in the world, but not in his world, a thing that was real but not for him, a thing that belonged to the people above and had nothing to do with the people below. But the children were in there, or the people who knew where the children were in there, or the people who could find out where the children were and bring them back were in there. And the in there was the only in there that mattered, was the only direction that pointed towards an answer, towards a solution, towards the possibility that the singing girl and the wire-tricked boy and the little ones with the cups were still alive and still whole and still themselves and not whatever the robed men made children into when they carried them away in soft hands. He could find out. The thought arrived not as a question but as a fact, as a thing that had always been true, and was only now being spoken aloud in the privacy of his own skull, and the speaking of it changed it, made it real, made it a thing that existed in the world and could not be unsaid. And the reality of it was terrifying because it meant he was going to have to do something about it, was going to have to leave his alley and his hole and his moisture collector, and go towards the fortress, towards the walls, towards the 100 meters of smooth, featureless impossibility that stood between where he was and where the answers were. He sighed, a long, slow exhalation that carried with it the particular weight of a child who has just made a decision that is too large for his body and too heavy for his shoulders and too impossible for his hands. And he got up, and he walked out of his hole, and he walked towards the massive gleaming fortress in the distance, surrounded by slums and hastily constructed buildings and barracks, because the walking was the only alternative to the staying, and the staying was the only alternative to the accepting, and the accepting was the thing he could not do, could not bring himself to do, could not make his hands do, because the accepting meant the singing girl was gone. And the wire-tricked boy was gone, and the little ones with the cups were gone, and no one was going to look for them, and no one was going to find them, and no one was going to bring them back unless he did it, unless his hands did it, unless his feet carried him up the wall and over the wall and into the fortress where the answers were. He stopped at the edge of the market, at the point where the stalls gave way to the open ground that separated the lower hives from the base of the fortress walls, and he looked up. The wall rose before him like a cliff face carved from the bones of the planet itself, smooth and gray and utterly without mercy, 100 meters of stone and reinforced metal that had been built to withstand orbital bombardment, and had never once in its existence been asked to withstand a 9-year-old boy with bare hands and bare feet, and a body that was too thin to hold the weight of what it was about to attempt. The luminous strips along the base cast their amber glow upward, illuminating the first few meters of the wall and leaving the rest in shadow. And the shadow was where the climb would happen, was where the hands would go, and the feet would follow, and the body would pull itself upward into the dark, where the machines could not see, and the guards could not hear, and the only thing that mattered was the next hold, the next 3 meters, the next breath. He pulled the last ration bar from his rags. The silver wrapper caught the amber light and threw it back in a dull, flat gleam, and he unwrapped it slowly, carefully, the way one unwraps a thing that is the last of its kind, that will not be replaced. That is the vital proof that tomorrow will come, and that he will still be in it, and he ate it standing up, chewing slowly, tasting nothing, feeling the gray paste dissolve on his tongue, like the memory of food, like the idea of nourishment, stripped of everything that made nourishment mean something. It was not enough, was never enough, was never going to be enough, but it was fuel, was calories, was the thing that would keep his muscles working for the next few hours. And the next few hours were all he needed, all he could plan for, all he could afford to think about, because thinking beyond the next few hours meant thinking about what would happen if he fell, and the falling was not a thing he could afford to think about because the thinking would make his hands shake, and the shaking would make him fall, and the falling would be the end. He finished the bar, wrapped the empty silver in his pocket because the silver might be worth something, might be tradable, might be the thing that bought him a copper tomorrow, if tomorrow came and he was still in it. He looked up at the wall again. He looked at the shadow above the amber glow. He looked at the smooth, featureless surface and the metal bands at intervals of 3 meters and the particular quality of a thing that has been built to be impossible. And he thought about the singing girl and the wire-tricked boy and the little ones with the cups, and he thought about his mother pressing the last of their food into his hands and saying, "Eat, you need it more than I do." And he thought about the robed men and their soft hands, and their quiet purpose, and their unhurried patience. And the thinking produced the decision, the way a blade produces a cut, cleanly, inevitably, without the possibility of the cut being unmade once the blade has passed through. He was going to climb it. In the room outside of time, the family watched the boy stand at the base of the wall and look up, and the watching was quiet, was heavy, was the particular quality of a group of beings who have just witnessed a child make a decision that no child should have to make, that no child should be capable of making, that speaks to a failure so vast and so fundamental that it cannot be addressed by any single action or any single person or any single moment of courage, and the failure was the thing that sat in their chest like a stone, like a weight, like a thing that could not be put down, because putting it down would mean admitting that they had seen it and done nothing, that they had watched the boy eat carrot peels from a bin and give coppers to old men and run from robed figures and sit in alleys with 3 coppers and 2 bars, and the knowledge that tomorrow the monsters might find him again. And the doing nothing was the thing that made the watching unbearable, was the thing that made the silence in the room not peaceful but suffocating, not restful but oppressive. Rogel spoke first, because Rogel always spoke first when the thing that needed to be said was a number, was a fact, was a calculation that could be performed and delivered with the particular flat precision of a man who understands that the world is built from measurements and that measurements do not lie, do not soften, do not offer comfort or consolation or the gentle fiction of possibility. He said, "The chances of a regular human scaling the main outer walls of the fortress of Hera without equipment are 0.0032%, and the saying of it was not cruel, was not meant to be cruel, was simply the truth delivered in the only language Rogel knew how to speak, the language of numbers, of probabilities, of the cold arithmetic of what is possible and what is not, and the number hung in the air with the particular finality of a verdict that has been read and cannot be appealed." And Konrad in his throne said nothing, because saying something would mean acknowledging that the boy on the screen was about to do something that concerned him, that the watching was not detached, was not academic, was not the observation of a phenomenon he had no interest in, and the not saying was the saying, was the acknowledgement, was the particular quality of a silence that means more than any word could mean, because the silence is where the feeling lives, where the caring hides, where the thing that he will not name sits in his chest and hums and refuses to be silenced. He was not worried, was absolutely, categorically, in no way whatsoever worried, was merely irritated, was merely inconvenienced, was merely watching a rat attempt something that rats should not attempt because rats do. Not climb walls, and rats do not break into fortresses, and rats do not look at 100 meters of smooth, featureless impossibility and decide that the deciding is going to happen anyway, because the boy was not a rat. And the knowing that the boy was not a rat was the thing that made the irritation feel too much like fear, and the fear was not a thing Konrad Curze permitted himself, and so the fear became the irritation, and the irritation became the silence, and the silence became the thing that filled the space where the caring should have been. Leman leaned forward in his throne, his eyes narrowing, his voice carrying the particular rough disbelief of a man who has just watched something he cannot believe but cannot look away from, and he said, "The kid isn't bloody well thinking of doing what I think he is he?" And the asking was not a question, was not really, was the asking of a man who already knows the answer and is simply confirming it aloud so that the confirming can make it real, can make it a thing that exists in the world and must be dealt with. And Roboute, hearing the question, hearing the confirmation, hearing the boy standing at the base of the wall with his empty silver wrapper in his pocket and his bare feet on the cold stone, said, "Please, no." And the please was quiet, was small, was the please of a man who has just been shown a future in which a child he has never met is about to climb a wall he built, and he cannot reach through the screen and stop it, cannot reach through the screen and say, "No, you don't have to do this, you don't have to be the one, you don't have to be the only person in the world who cares enough to try, because the trying is too much, is too heavy, is too impossible for hands that small and feet that bare and a body that thin." And the please was the only thing he could offer, the only thing that could cross the distance between the watching and the happening. And the offering was not enough, was never going to be enough, but it was all he had. And Konrad, in his throne, most surely not getting worried, most surely not caring, most surely not feeling the thing in his chest that tightened when he saw the boy look up at the wall, most surely not recognizing himself in the small, thin figure standing at the base of an impossible thing and deciding to attempt it anyway, because the alternative was to stand there and do nothing and let the monsters win, most surely not seeing his own hands in the boy's bare fingers, his own stubbornness in the boy's set jaw, his own refusal to accept the unacceptable in the boy's quiet, steady, absolutely certain decision to climb. And the most surely was the lie, was the wall, was the architecture of denial that Konrad Curze had spent 3,000 years building and maintaining and defending, and the lie was cracking, was splintering, was showing the thing beneath it, the thing that cared, the thing that watched, the thing that was terrified, not because the boy might fall, but because the boy might succeed, and the succeeding would mean the boy was his, would mean the boy was not a rat, would mean the boy was not a stray, would mean the boy was a son, and the son was the thing Konrad Curze could not afford to have, because the having meant the losing, and the losing was the thing he feared most in all. The vast and indifferent machinery of the universe. On the screen, Damien was not thinking about the probability. He was not thinking about 0.0032%, or about the machines that could see in the dark, or the guards with their bolt rounds, or the smooth, featureless surface that had been built to be impossible. He was thinking about the singing girl's voice, about the way it threaded through the crowd like a silver wire, about the way it made the market feel less like a market and more like a place where people lived, and he was thinking about the wire trick boy's grin, about the way it showed too many teeth and made you feel like you were in on a joke that no one else understood. And he was thinking about the little ones with the cups, about the way their silence was the same as his silence, about the way their smallness was the same as his smallness, about the way their disappearing was the same disappearing that was coming for him if he did not move, if he did not climb, if he did not put his hands on the stone and pull himself upward into the dark where the answers were. He pressed his palms flat against the wall, felt its texture, its temperature, its absolute indifference to him, the way it resisted him, the way it said, "No, you cannot. You are nothing. You are a child with bare hands and bare feet, and no business being here." And the saying was, the saying that the world had been saying to him his entire life, the saying of the market stalls and the armed guards and the fresh bread he could not afford and the ration bars that were not enough and the sky that was rust and the colors that were gray and green and red and nothing else. And the saying had been true for 9 years, had been the truth of his existence, had been the thing that kept him small and thin and hungry and alone. And he was done with it, was done with the saying, was done with the no, was done with the you cannot, because the singing girl was in the fortress, and the wire-tricked boy was in the fortress, and the little ones with the cups were in the fortress, and the no was going to be answered with hands, with fingers, with the pulling of a body upward into the dark, where the no could not reach him, because the no was at the bottom, and he was going to be at the top. He dug his fingers into the stone, not into cracks, not into seams, not into the spaces between the metal bands, but into the stone itself, his fingertips pressing and pushing and then sinking, leaving behind tiny holes where his fingers had been, as though the stone were clay, as though it were soft, as though it had been waiting for him all along, waiting for the small, thin boy with the bare feet and the empty stomach and the absolutely certain knowledge that the climbing was going to happen, because the not climbing was not an option, was not a choice, was not a thing his hands could do, because his hands could only climb, could only reach, could only pull, because the pulling was the only language his body knew how to speak when the world said no. He pulled himself up. 3 meters. 5. The amber glow of the lumen strips fell away beneath him. The market became a distant smear of noise and light. The lower hives became a dark expanse of rust and shadow, and the wall became the only thing, the only world, the only reality. The smooth, gray surface beneath his fingers, and the next hold above, and the next breath in his lungs, and the next 3 meters of dark between where he was and where he was going, and the climbing was not graceful, was not elegant, was not the controlled ascent of a trained mountaineer, but the desperate, thoughtless persistence of water climbing a wall in a storm, hand over hand, foot over foot, the body doing what the body does when the mind has stopped calculating and started simply refusing to stop, refusing to fall, refusing to let the singing girl be gone, and the wire-tricked boy be gone, and the little ones with the cups be gone, refusing to let the robed men win, refusing to let the dark be the last word, refusing to let the silence be the inheritance. And in the room outside of time, the family watched the boy climb, and the watching was not quiet anymore, was not silent, was filled with the particular quality of breath being held, and hearts beating, and a slow, grinding realization that the probability does not matter, that the number does not matter, that 0.0032% is a calculation for regular humans, and the boy is not a regular human, is not a calculation, is not a probability, is a child with bleeding fingers and an empty stomach, and a stubbornness that has no medical explanation, and a refusal that has no mathematical expression. And the climbing is happening, is real, is the thing that is happening right now in the space between one heartbeat and the next. And the happening is the thing that makes the probability irrelevant, that makes the number meaningless, that makes the watching not an observation but a witness, not a calculation but prayer. And the prayer is the thing that none of them will admit to making, the prayer that says, don't fall, don't fall, don't fall. And the falling is the thing that none of them can prevent, and the preventing is the thing that none of them can do, and the doing nothing is the silence, and the silence is the inheritance. The screen held. The boy climbed. The wall was 100 meters tall. The night was dark. The fortress waited, and the hands kept going, kept pulling, kept climbing, because the climbing was the only answer to the question of what happens when the monsters take your friends and no one else is going to do anything about it. And the answer is, you climb, you climb, you climb until your fingers bleed and your arms burn and your lungs scream and the wall is still above you and you are still below it, and the only direction is up, and the up is the thing, is the only thing, is the thing that keeps the hands moving when the mind says stop and the body says stop and the world says stop and the singing girl says eat. You need it more than I do. The wire trick boy says show off, and the little ones with the cups say nothing, say nothing, say nothing, and the nothing is the silence, and the silence is the thing that keeps the hands moving, and the hands keep moving, and the boy keeps climbing, and the wall keeps being 100 meters tall, and the night keeps being dark, and the fortress keeps waiting, And the waiting is the inheritance. The moon was high when he began, though calling it a moon was generous, since nothing on Macragga was quite real in the way that moons and skies and open horizons were real in other worlds. It was a glow, a plate, a vast disk of reflected light set into the upper architecture of the hive, casting its pale imitation down through the layers of metal and stone until it reached the lowest levels as a thin, watery thing, stripped of warmth, stripped of meaning, useful only insofar as it allowed a boy to see where to put his hands. Damien stood at the base of the wall and looked up. And the looking itself was a kind of violence, because the wall did not end. It rose and rose and rose, 100 meters of smooth stone, reinforced with metal bands at intervals of perhaps 3 meters, offering no handholds, no footholds, no concession to the small thin body that stood beneath. It with bleeding fingers already, an empty stomach already, and the particular, quiet certainty of a creature that has decided to do something impossible because the alternative is to do nothing at all. He pressed his palms flat against the stone and felt its texture, its temperature, its absolute indifference to him. And then he dug his fingers in, not into cracks, not into seams, but into the stone itself, his fingertips pressing and pushing and then sinking, leaving behind tiny holes where his fingers had been, as though the stone were clay, as though it had been, waiting for him all along. He pulled himself upward, found another hold, dug in again, pulled, climbed, and the climbing was not graceful, was not elegant, was not the controlled ascent of a trained mountaineer, but the desperate, thoughtless persistence of water climbing a wall in a storm, hand over hand, foot over foot, 3 meters, 5, 10, 20, his fingers bleeding, his toes aching, his arms burning with the particular fire of muscles that had not been fed enough to sustain this kind of effort. He did not look down, because looking down meant thinking, and thinking meant calculating, and calculating meant realizing that he was 20 meters up a wall with no safety line and no second chance, and no one in the world who would catch him if he fell, and so he looked up instead, at the next hold, the next 3 meters, the next hand, the next breath, the next small increment of survival. Somewhere in the room outside of time, a voice spoke with the quiet precision of a man who observed the world, the way a surgeon observes a wound, with detachment, with focus, with the particular stillness of someone who has learned that feeling too much makes the hands shake. Corvus noted that the boy was surprisingly agile, surprisingly strong, far more so than the state of his body should permit, and that the Primarch blood was compensating, burning through reserves it did not have to fuel, reflexes and strength that a normal child's body could not produce. He paused, watched the boy climb, and added that by every metric of physiology and nutrition, the child should have collapsed at 30 meters, perhaps 40, because his body simply did not have the fuel. And yet here he was, still climbing, still pulling himself upward with bleeding fingers and an empty stomach and a stubbornness that had no medical explanation. And beside him, in a throne that seemed to swallow the light around it, Konrad Curze said 2 words, quietly, flatly, in the way one says them when one has already decided that what one is seeing is not happening, is not real, is not occurring in any universe that one is prepared to acknowledge. He said, "Oh," and then he said, "For fuck's sake," and then he said nothing more, because saying more would mean admitting that he was watching, that he cared, that the small thin figure scaling 100 meters of stone with bleeding fingers and an empty stomach was anything other than a rat, a stray, a disruption to the security system, a nothing that would be dealt with and forgotten, and he did not admit such things, had never admitted such things, would never admit such things, because admitting them would mean feeling something, and feeling something was not something Konrad Curze did. The wall changed as he climbed higher, the stone giving way to metal, to reinforced plating, to the upper architecture of the fortress where the walkways were, and the guard posts and the security systems they could see. In the dark, and hear a whisper at 100 meters, and Damien could feel the shift beneath his fingers, the way the air was different up here, Thinner, colder, carrying the faint hum of machinery and the distant sound of boots on metal, and his arms were shaking. His vision was blurring at the edges. His body was screaming at him in the language of lactic acid and oxygen debt, and the slow grinding failure of muscles that had been asked to do more than they had fuel to sustain. But he pressed his cheek against a stone and breathed, and felt the cold of it against his skin, and told himself, not yet, not done, not finished, and he climbed. He pulled himself over the lip of the walkway and fell flat on his face, not gracefully, not with the controlled roll of a trained acrobat, but simply, completely, his entire body hitting the cold metal grating with a sound like a sack of wet gravel being dropped from a height, his chin striking the ground, his knees striking the ground, everything striking the ground all at once, and he lay there breathing, staring at the metal, grating inches from his nose, and then he sat up and huffed a strand of hair out of his face and looked back at the wall he had just climbed, 100 meters of smooth, featureless impossibility, and he thought to himself, with the genuine, uncomplicated surprise of a child who has just accomplished something he was told could not be done, that it hadn't been so hard at all. In the room outside of time, Konrad Curze pressed his palm against his forehead and pushed until the bones cracked, and Corvus observed beside him, with the quiet precision of a man noting a tactical error, that falling flat on one's face upon reaching the top was not, strictly speaking, the best way to go about a stealth operation, and Konrad said nothing, could not say anything, because saying anything would mean acknowledging what he had just witnessed, and acknowledging it would mean feeling something about it, and he did not feel things, was not capable of feeling things, did not feel things about small thin boys who climbed walls with their bare hands and then fell on their faces, and then sat up and thought it hadn't been so hard. Damien got to his feet and brushed the grit from his knees and looked around, and the walkway stretched in both directions, lit by the pale amber glow of lumen strips set into the walls at intervals, with guard posts at regular intervals and security cameras mounted on swiveling brackets, and the faint hum of voxcasters and the distant sound of boots, the fortress alive around him, breathing, watching, listening. And he grinned, because he was actually in, unnoticed, unseen, just like the Night Haunter would do it. And he had seen the posters, "Fear not the night, for it is haunted by our own Lord." And he had imagined this, the Night Haunter, moving through the dark, unseen, unstoppable, a shadow among shadows. And now here was Damien doing the same thing, moving through the dark, unseen, unstoppable. And he giggled, actually giggled, pressed his hand over his mouth to stifle it, but the sound leaked out anyway, small and bright, and entirely too loud for a boy who was supposed to be sneaking through the most secure fortress on Macrage. He stuck to the shadows, or what he believed to be shadows, pressing his back against the wall, moving quickly, silently, the way he imagined the Night Haunter moved, which was to say, not silently at all, his bare feet slapping against the metal grating, his breathing too loud, his rags rustling with every movement, and he was by any objective measure the least stealthy intruder in the history of the fortress. But he did not know that. He thought he was invisible. He thought he was the Night Haunter. He thought the shadows were his allies, and the dark was his cloak, and no one would ever see him because he was small and thin and quick, and the Night Haunter was his hero. And the Night Haunter was never caught, and he turned a corner and walked into a lumen strip and stood in full blazing amber light for 3 complete seconds, looked around, saw no one, nodded to himself, and turned back into the shadow, convinced he was doing magnificently. In the room outside of time, Konrad Curze turned around in his throne and smashed his head against the backrest with such force that the backrest simply broke away, falling to the floor with a clang that echoed through the silence, and he stayed there, forehead pressed against the broken throne, groaning low and long and pained, and the Emperor, watching from his own throne with the particular amusement of a being who has seen everything and is surprised by nothing, remarked that it was rather quick of him to throw the boy under the bus, And for shame, and Konrad did not respond, could not respond, because responding would mean lifting his head, and lifting his head would mean looking at the screen, and looking at the screen would mean watching the boy walk into a lumen strip and stand there, fully illuminated, grinning at nothing, thinking he was invisible. The security cameras found him 4 minutes later, and it was, in the grand scheme of the fortress's security apparatus, a minor event, a blip, an anomaly, a small biometric signature at rear entrance 212 Bravo that did not match any registered personnel, any known visitor, any documented presence, and the system flagged it and sent it to the watch station. And the watch station operator, a man who had been awake for 19 hours and was on his third recaf, glanced at the alert, glanced at the screen, saw a small, thin figure in rags standing in a hallway looking around with enormous dark eyes, blinked, tapped his partner on the shoulder, and his partner looked and blinked and looked again, and they looked at each other, then down at their recafs, sniffed them carefully, took another sip, and one of them asked whether they should wake the commander, and the other, too busy dunking his nutrient bar into his recaf, said no. Just call it into the unurgent Vox. That way they did something and couldn't be blamed for it. And he picked up the Vox and sent the most appropriate code for the situation, and the situation escalated. Within 10 minutes, 9 hunter teams were deployed. Within 20, 29. Within 30, 56. The Vox chatter filled the fortress like water filling a basin. Team 9 reporting loss of sight on the query. Team 29 confirming target heading for the kitchens. Team 56 declaring they would get him. Team 57 asking, with the particular bewilderment of a man who has just been told something he cannot believe, whether command was confirming that they were chasing after a fucking kid. And Team 58 confirming, yes, this child scaled the wall by himself with no tools, and in the room outside of time, Roboute Guilliman leaned forward and asked, his voice tight, how many teams it was taking to catch one child. And, Lorder corrected him quietly, one prime child. And Roboute closed his eyes and opened them and closed them again and said, true. So it made sense, he supposed, though it did not make sense. None of it made sense, but the teams were deployed, and the boy was running, and the fortress was vast, and the night was long, and no one could reach through the screen and say, stop, you don't have to do this, you don't have to run, you don't have to be hungry, you don't have to be alone. He ran the way he always ran, weaving, darting, slipping between crates and under tables and through gaps in the architecture that were too small for an armored man but just large enough for a boy with no meat on his bones, his bare feet slapping against metal grating, his rags flapping, his breath coming in short, sharp gasps. And he ran not because he was afraid, but because his body told him to run, because his blood told him to run, because the half-Primarch instincts that hummed beneath his skin said, move. They are coming, they are many, they are fast, and you are small and thin and hungry, and you cannot fight them, so run. And he ran through corridors and across walkways and down stairwells until he smelled it. Food, real food, not the gray paste of ration bars, not the chemical sweetness of synthetic grain, but actual food, the smell of it hitting him like a physical blow, rich, warm, organic, alive, coming from the kitchens where the morning meal was being assembled for the fortress's garrison. The smell of roasting meat and baking bread and vegetables being chopped and herbs being crushed and fat sizzling in pans. His body stopped before his mind could tell it to keep going. His legs locking, his head turning, his nostrils flaring, the smell wrapping around him like a hand, pulling him, dragging him, overriding every instinct that said run, hide, survive, with the single, overwhelming, all-consuming imperative of eat. And he followed it the way a starving dog follows a scent, through corridors and down stairwells and past guard posts that were looking the wrong way, and he found the kitchens, And he found the bins, not the food itself, not the prepared meals, not the roasting meat, not the fresh bread, but the bins, the waste, the scraps, the things that had been trimmed away, discarded, deemed not good enough for the plates of the garrison. Vegetable peels and meat trimmings and stale crusts and the offcuts and the ends and the forgotten corners. And he climbed in, sank to his knees in the waste, and ate. In the room outside of time, Sanguinius spoke, his voice very quiet, the voice of a man who has seen something he cannot unsee. And he said that the boy was inside a trash can, and Vulcan beside him, vast and gentle, confirmed that yes, he was, poor child. And Corvus observed with clinical precision that the boy had gone through 58 teams trying to catch him, and was now inside a trash can eating trash. And Ferris said, quieter still, that hunger drives people to do unreasonable things, and no one argued, no one could, because the boy was eating carrot peels from a bin and discovering, with the wide-eyed wonder of a child tasting something new, that they were actually kind of sweet, that he had never tasted a carrot before, not a real one, not a fresh one, not one that had been grown in soil and pulled from the earth and was still crisp and alive, with flavor. And the discovery of this small sweetness in the midst of garbage was somehow more devastating than any amount of suffering could have been. And in his throne, Konrad Curze gripped the armrests and said, "Someone, stop this kid." And Leman beside him, grinning, asked if he was implying he actually cared. And Konrad said through gritted teeth, with the particular fury of a man whose mask is cracking and who knows it is cracking and who cannot stop it from cracking, that his reputation was on the damn line, and that was the only reason why, and it was not the only reason. They all knew it was not the only reason, but saying so would mean admitting something, and admitting something was not something Konrad Curze did, and he watched the boy eat carrot peels from a bin and did not look away, could not look away, because looking away would mean that he did not care, and not caring was the only architecture he had left. The boy ate until he could not eat any more, until his stomach was full, actually full, properly full, full in a way it had not been full in longer than he could remember, and he sat back in the bin breathing, his hands filthy, his face filthy, his rags soaked with something wet and organic and probably not water, and for the first time in longer than he could remember he was not hungry, not in the sharp animal furious way, not in the structural bone deep way, and he closed his eyes and leaned back against the side of the bin, and for a moment, just a moment, he was not thin, not alone, not the boy with the dead mother and the absent father and the arithmetic of survival ticking in his skull. He was just a boy sitting in a bin, full, warm, almost happy, and the almost was the cruelest word in any language, because it meant he was close, so close to the thing that other children had without thinking, without earning, without climbing 100 meters of stone in the dark with bleeding fingers. And yet it was still not quite his, still not quite real, still conditional on the next meal, the next copper, the next day. And in the room outside of time, the gods watched the boy sit in the bin and close his eyes, and no one spoke, because there was nothing to say that would not make the saying of it worse. And the screen held, and the boy breathed, and the bin was warm, and the fortress hummed around him, vast and indifferent. 58 teams still searching for a boy who was sitting in a trash can, with his eyes closed and his stomach full and his heart almost quiet, not yet caught, not yet found, but soon, because the night was ending and the morning was coming, and the morning would bring questions, and questions would bring answers, and answers would bring a man with dark eyes and taloned hands and a voice like gravel dragged over glass. And that man would find him, and nothing would be the same again.